Ronald Reagan. In 1992, he came to Oxford University and gave a speech in which he said, the end of the Cold War has robbed the West of its uplifting common purpose. But he said, don't worry, because I think I found a solution. And that is that the Western military, I mean, obviously he meant the American military, but others too can free to join in, will be, he said, a steel fist in a humanitarian velvet glove.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Phil Hammond, an Emeritus Professor of Media and Communications Studies at the London's South Bank University. He's the author of various books, among them War Games, Memory, Militarism and the Subject of Play, and Screens of Terror, Representations of War and Terrorism in Film and Television since 9/11. Phil, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to this, because you have researched how war has been represented and shown to us for a long time. And by us, I mean especially in Western film and media. Can you maybe give us the gist of what you found out, or how you judge this representation until now?
Well, that's quite a big question.
Yeah.
So, I suppose a lot of what I've written about is very well-worn territory, the way that the media work propagandistically in wartime. There's nothing particularly new or surprising about that. The thing that I suppose that I did try to, at a certain point, I did try to approach somewhat differently, was to try and understand what had changed in the kind of post-Cold War era in the representation of war, and why it was that media image and presentation had become, I mean, they've always been important, but even more important, kind of almost overridingly important, to the extent that it seemed to be a kind of a fundamental consideration when even at a level of policy making or operational decisions about military actions. How the question in the back of the people making those decisions, at the back of their mind was, how is it going to look? How is it going to play out in the media? So I got quite kind of interested in that, and I in a nutshell, I suppose I put that down to political changes that happened at the end of the Cold War, and I'm thinking of how war and conflict changed really in the 1990s and early 2000s as a consequence of those political changes.
So what were those? How do these political changes go together then with the representation?
Well, I wrote a book called Media, War and Postmodernity, which is all about that. And if you wanted to put it in a nutshell, you'd say it was the end of left and right, and the end of left-right politics. Perhaps that doesn't seem terribly kind of impressive as an explanation. Everyone's kind of used to that idea that the old politics of left and right are not the same as they used to be, even though we continue using those terms. But really what happened, I think, as a consequence of the end of the Cold War, was what the French international relations theorist Saki Laidi calls a world without meaning. We were left in a world without a kind of horizon of meaning, without any kind of forward-looking project or prospect for where society was heading. It's a kind of, you might perhaps think of it as similar to Francis Fukuyama's
End of history.
Abused end of history thesis. It's a kind of similar idea that something epochal changed around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall at the end of the 1980s. And yeah, and I think that there is a good argument to be made. I tried to make it in that book about the consequences of that for international relations and for war, and as part of that, the role that the media play in war.
Is so, I mean, by the end of that period, that horizon to understand the world, you mean this end of the bipolarity of these two systems that are in a struggle, and the idea that, oh, now everything is different. Now there's a unified understanding of the world. Is it that?
Yes, and indeed, if you look back at the moment when that happened, assessments of it were actually quite upbeat. In fact, that's putting it mildly. They were kind of wildly, in retrospect, you'd say kind of wildly over optimistic. The talk back then was, how we were going to have a peace dividend. The UN would finally work properly without the kind of
The vetoing.
the kind of stalemate of the US versus the Soviet veto. Not long after, the first President Bush Senior, proclaimed a new world order. It seemed kind of quite an optimistic moment, but it didn't last very long. I think that one thing that's quite striking, if you look back at the time when it happened and then how events were discussed, is a curious kind of discussion about what they called enemy deprivation syndrome. Is an odd thing to say, is that you think it'd be quite good not to have any enemies, but in fact it was problematic for them not to have a clear enemy. Because during that whole quite long Cold War era, it was very clear who the good guys were, who the bad guys were. At least that's how people thought about it. You knew who was on whose side. You knew what the West stood for, even if it was only kind of defined in a kind of negative way against what the West was opposing. And all of a sudden that kind of collapsed. So without a clear kind of adversary, without a kind of clear alternative, well, what did the West exactly stand for? What, for example, was NATO for? What was it? What was the purpose? And so there's a kind of search that starts in the 1990s for new ways of managing international affairs and new ways of giving it some sense of meaning and purpose.
I think
one of the main ways that was attempted was precisely through war and conflict.
I think this is a very important observation, and I think this is one that will strike all of us in the West, who also were showered with the cultural output of Hollywood and so on, which is intuitively very understandable. In the 90s and the 2000s, you suddenly have all of these spy movies that actually say like, "Oh, wasn't the time better when we had the Soviets?" There's tons of those, right? And you can see how James Bond flips from being anti-Soviet, of being anti-terrorist, of hunting even at some point the North Koreans with a laser beam that they were trying to kill the world with and stuff like that. But the Soviets were gone, right? The Cold was gone. And you think that actually kind of, through also the representation in media and culture, had a feedback loop on then how the media starts representing world affairs?
Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking about kind of fictional representations, yes, and that that there are, as you say, there are attempts to find some new plausible enemies. I think probably the prime candidate is Arabs and Islamists. They're the kind of the primary kind of alternative villains. But point I would make about it is that it's more far-reaching than just, what do Hollywood scriptwriters come up with. It's also a question of what do those in the media dealing with news and current affairs, what journalists, how do they interpret the world for their audiences, and even more fundamentally, how do politicians and leaders, how do they understand this new world? And you see repeated attempts through the 90s to resolve that issue and to find new enemies. And there's a tendency to hark back to the Second World War and to constantly wish to be replaying World War II. So you have, the first kind of major example, I suppose, is Saddam Hussein in the 1991 Gulf War is the new Hitler. Not long after that, from 1992, we're told that the Serbs in what was then Yugoslavia are the new Nazis. It's like a kind of a sense that today's the kind of prosaic reality of actually fairly small scale, relatively speaking, conflicts isn't enough, and you have to kind of present them as this kind of epic battle between good and evil. And why do you want to do that? You want to do that because it means that you stand for something important. You're not just interfering in somebody else's local civil war. You are standing for the good with a capital G against evil with a capital E. That's the kind of, I think, sort of narcissistic tendency that develops in Western politics and media presentation of war.
It is a wonderful observation, because I don't think that world leaders in the Cold War, I can't really recall that anyone tried to link or liken the Soviets to the Nazis. Nobody tried to make that argument. The Soviets were good enough as an enemy of their own and own category. They didn't need to be recast as Nazis. Whereas after the Cold War, everybody's being recast as Nazis, including Hamas is Nazis, including the Russians are the Nazis. I mean, now they are. I mean, now this Second World War analog comes out time and again, especially the Munich 1938 argument: you cannot appease evil, you cannot appease the Nazis, therefore we must go to war. And so would you say that this is something that decidedly post-Cold War?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you could say, perhaps you could argue that there is a kind of equivalence made between the Soviets and the Nazis in the theory of totalitarianism.
Mm.
That there was an attempt to say, well, we'll lump those two together, which is, I'm not, it's not a very convincing argument, but the argument was often made that they were both kind of in some way versions of the same thing, a kind of repressive, authoritarian, totalitarian system, but just with different faces. So that was a kind of Cold War era idea, but that's a little bit different from what I think happens after the end of the Cold War, which is this kind of this sense that there is a kind of hollowness, a meaninglessness in Western political life. And in that era, in the 90s, really right through till, I would say, kind of mid 20-teens, so relatively recently, about 10 years ago or so, right up until then, there was a kind of, the main kind of problem that Western elites were facing was that their publics were essentially not interested. There's a kind of withdrawal from public life. There's a kind of just a lack of basic kind of interest. And you see that reflected in lots of different ways that people, when people do opinion polls, people are less and less interested in public affairs. There's a kind of turning away from the public sphere towards more private individual concerns. There's a decline in the membership of political parties, but not just political parties, but all kinds of sort of community organizations, churches, anything that represents a kind of collectivity of shared meaning and purpose somehow seems unattractive. And that's a kind of, maybe that's a kind of an indication of the problem that confronts elites and leaders seeking to try and give their societies some sense of meaning and direction. I personally, I think that there's essentially been three major attempts over that period to find a replacement. The first one, two of them are concerned with war and conflict. The first one is what you might call humanitarianism and the human rights, a kind of humanitarian war. So we, the West, stand for the good in the sense that we uphold human rights. We act in the name of humanitarianism. And you can see that in various ways. I think it really starts at the very end of the 1991 Gulf War with the April 91 Kurdish crisis. Don't know if you remember that, but that was kind of an important, and people hailed that at the time as a wonderful development that this showed the emergence of what they called global civil society, and the media were thought to, by some commentators, to play an important part in that, arguing for greater attention and care to be paid to the suffering of vulnerable people, in this case, Iraqi Kurds. And then not long after, you get similar arguments being replayed in Somalia in 1992, where there's the big armed humanitarian intervention. And then very soon after that in Bosnia, armed humanitarianism, and so you get a kind of repeated iteration of that, culminating at the end of the decade in 1999 with the Kosovo War, which is said to be, it was said at the time to be a war waged for human rights. It was a humanitarian bombing, said NATO. That was the new purpose that the West seemed to have found. And it's interesting because it was actually announced right at the beginning of the decade by Ronald Reagan, believe it or not, the former American president. He might not think of us having much in common with the kind of humanitarian liberal interventionists of the 90s. But in 1992, he came to Oxford University and gave a speech in which he said, the end of the Cold War has robbed the West of its uplifting common purpose. But he said, don't worry, because I think I found a solution. And that is that the Western military, I mean, obviously he meant the American military, but others too free to join in, will be, he said, a humanitarian, a steel fist in a humanitarian velvet glove. Mm-hmm. That's the new role for the Western military. And that was the end of December 1992. And he made that speech on the same day that George Bush, the first George Bush, who had been, of course, Reagan's vice president, was sending the US Marines to Somalia to enact that role of the iron fist and the humanitarian velvet glove. So that's the kind of first major framework, I think, for reworking what's the new uplifting common purpose. That's then, you could say that is somehow, to some extent, overtaken in, excuse me, in 2001 with 9/11 and the War on Terror. That's then a kind of second framework. Although in the event, I think what happens is that those two become kind of somehow merged together, so that the military operations in first Afghanistan and then Iraq from 2003 somehow seem to start taking on that humanitarian militarist character rather than simply being a purely anti-terrorist operation. So those are the two main frameworks as regards war and conflict in that era. The third thing I would throw in, although this is, I know, off topic, but there is a similar kind of attempt made to find a new framework in the area of climate change. So in the environment and climate change are also offered up as new political frameworks to facilitate international cooperation, to give a kind of meaning and direction to Western policy.
Yeah, and this idea of we have to do this, and we meaning the West leading and everybody else needs to follow, otherwise we're all doomed and we all die. And we actually see that language repeat with Corona, or saw it repeating. It was kind of mini episode, but the similar approach toward either we do X or we all die, therefore you're with us or against us. A ton of question with this. The bigger question is, like, do you think this goes back to this Manichaean element, but as a lack of better word, within like Western culture, that understanding the world in terms of friends and enemies, good and evil, God and devil, which goes back millennia, right? That's just a big one. The smaller one, and maybe it's better to talk about that one first. Do you think this was a conscious process? You said Ronald Reagan proposed that. Was he part of the people who manufactured this change? Or were they just reading the signs of the time, telling you, look, it's pretty clear now what's going to happen. I'm going to forecast this. What do you think was it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think to a certain extent that there is a kind of conscious choice, and you can see quite deliberate episodes of kind of image making from the word go. So I mean, that example that I cited there, where Reagan's making that speech the same day George Bush is giving a national television address sending the Marines to Somalia. So when the Marines arrived in Somalia, some no doubt cynical journalists claimed that the timing of that beach landing in Somalia was arranged so that it would fit the TV schedules in the US. So it's staged as a media event, right? The Marines come off the ships, they storm up the beaches as if they're engaged in some dangerous military operation.
Normandy.
Yeah, a bit like that. And what do they encounter? They encounter journalists. They encounter Western journalists who are holding cameras and microphones and are trying to interview them. And it's a kind of the soldiers were a little bit annoyed by this because the cameras, the lights, it's interfering with their night vision goggles and all the rest of it. They weren't expecting this, but the journalists were invited to be there by the Pentagon. So this set up as a kind of spectacular media performance, and it kind of in that instance it kind of falls a little bit flat because it's sort of too obviously staging. There's a kind of weird incongruity between this performance of a military operation, which isn't really a military operation, and the media attempting to do these interviews. So that kind of episode, and that obviously that's not the only one, that kind of thing does suggest that there is a kind of conscious and deliberate thing, but that's not to say that it's all just a kind of cool, calculated manipulation. I think that there is the elites themselves are, you mentioned like Corona and the pandemic. And the thing that made me think of is that there is often invoked in these scenarios, there's often invoked a kind of politics of fear that we should be afraid, that there's some terrible risk or danger that means that we have to act. And obviously that is, that is manipulative, but I also think that elites themselves are not immune to those fears, that they are also genuinely kind of worried and afraid of some of the things that they tell us to be afraid of. And I also think that you're right to say that there is a kind of, reading of the room, as it were. There is often a kind of opportunistic or reactive quality to Western policymaking in regards, especially to war and conflict. Things are seen as a kind of an opportunity to act, or and then that kind of takes on a momentum of its own. But I would also add that especially in the early stages of this period in the 1990s, it's not as if politicians are on their own doing this and kind of puppeteering it all behind the scenes. Far from it. I think that they are one set of actors engaged in this, and that there are other actors too. One might look to the role, for example, of NGOs, or indeed the role of journalists, and they are engaged in similar activities. They are also trying to A, make sense of the world, and B, find them a role for themselves within that, either as direct actors or as interpreters of the world for their wider audiences. And especially as regards humanitarian militarism as it develops in the 90s, I think journalists played an incredibly important role in co-creating that idea of the West's new role in the world as a kind of savior of humanity.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see quite beautifully also listening to the stories of a couple of journalists, like how these developments went hand in hand. I think one of the most important ones is the testimony of what's his name? He also has a very good YouTube show and speaks out very regularly. Former war correspondent for the New York Times.
Thank you.
Chris Hedges, of course. Who also gave accounts about in the past being then working in war zones and the adrenaline that it invokes, and then the shift of the US of embedding journalism, right, to protect them, but actually that's just to make sure that they observe the battlefield the way that they're supposed to observe it, and how some journalists went along and others didn't, and they go to the other side and try to portray it from there, but then you're being outcast and you're being rejected, and you don't find a place anymore to write, and you have to quit from mainstream journalism, and how this basically creates this stream, right, of that Noam Chomsky and Herman warned us about, that, well, you only, in a propagandistic environment, journalists can only go and so far, although they're not directly instructed, and you're kind of saying, like, also for the politicians, they don't necessarily directly instruct, but they co-create then this environment. And I think, if I understand you correctly, you are actually bringing it back to this issue of a lack of a proper enemy, and a lack of sense making, or a problem of meaning.
Yeah, so I mean, you could tell that story, I think, from the taking as the starting point that thing you mentioned of embedding of journalists. That was talked about in 2003 in the Iraq War. That's when we heard this term, embedded journalists. But it wasn't a new thing by any means. It really, you could see that the first kind of use of that policy in 1982 in the Falklands War, when the British authorities did exactly that. First of all, because it was a long way away, the Falkland Islands, they handpicked the correspondents who were going to go with the task force, as it was called, to the South Atlantic and fight that war. They had control over who was going, and then they attached all those journalists to military units. They were each assigned a minder to vet their copy before they sent anything back to London. So it was very, very tightly controlled in terms of, where they could go, what they could see, and what they could send back. Why did they do that? Well, they did that because they were looking at what had happened in Vietnam. The Vietnam is the kind of first major kind of turning point in terms of media-military relations. And the story that's told about Vietnam, the lesson, as it were, that was learned from Vietnam was that you can't trust the media in wartime. They're going to stab you in the back if you give them too much freedom. And so by the time of the Falklands War, the British said, well, we don't want that to happen. We can't let these people just run loose. We're going to have to corral them. We're going to have to control them. We're going to have to, nobody said censor. They always just said vetting for the copy. But essentially, we're going to have to censor them if need be. And the US authorities looked at what the British had done in the Falklands and thought, well, that looks pretty good. That's a sensible way to proceed. Did a very similar, had a very similar kind of approach in the invasion of Grenada, for example, in 1983, where they just tried to keep the media away until it was all over. 1989, with the invasion of Panama, did the same thing, just don't have the media there at all. And that you can also see in the 1991 Gulf War, where there's what they called a pool system, where again you had accreditation of correspondence. If you were outside that system, as what they called a unilateral, you were on your own and you were, at your own risk. Be safe, be with us. We'll take you where you need to go and show you what you need to see. So that was the policy right up until 1991. But I think even in 91, you can begin to see the start of something new, which is a realization that rather than just kind of starving the media of information, maybe it's more sensible instead to kind of feed them information, to give them lots of stuff. So let's just give them material. Let's hold press conference after press conference. Let's hand them footage from the nose cones of missiles so they can watch the smart weapons hitting their targets with precision accuracy. And that will tell the story that we want told, which is, by the way, a completely false story, but never mind. Let them tell that story by giving them information rather than trying to just keep them in the dark. And I think that in the 90s, in fact, one BBC journalist, I think it was Nick Gowing, made this point about how striking it was that in Bosnia, Western journalists were very keen to have a kind of pool system under the auspices of the UN when they had complained bitterly about the kind of constraints of a pool system that was operated in 1991 in the Gulf.
A pool system
All of a sudden they see themselves, well, they start to see themselves as kind of collaborators with the Western military, as kind of part of the same team.
What's a pool system? Meaning a pool of media to then
Yes, so that you have a kind of regulated system of reporting and pooled reporting, so that you're not competing. The idea is that you're not competing with each other. You're sharing the same pooled information, and there's a kind of assurance there that you will have enough information that you're able to then feed to whatever your particular media outlet is. And journalists wanted that kind of collaboration with the military in Bosnia. And by the time you get to the end of that decade, the Kosovo conflict, and even also you could say in Afghanistan in 2001, there is this sense that the media are kind of part of the team. We've come an awful long way from the Falklands, where the idea is you can't trust the journalists, to then, oh, well, actually, journalists are kind of on side and they're kind of useful asset. Colin Powell, I think, even said words to that effect, that the media are a kind of battle winning asset for us.
Yeah, but
You know,
isn't this fascinating? And also that the that the self-image of a lot of media, especially in the United States, you hear that a lot, that the media is the fourth branch of government, and speaking truth to power. But then at the same time, you have White House, what is it called? The media gathering that they do once a year, and the press gathering,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the whole the feeding, the hand feeding of journalists who then get access to certain things, and that will propel the career. But it's still understood that this is the great art, and also standing on the right side of history, right? Of a lot of journalists who actually say we need to protect the good information, right? So that also in climate change and corona we can protect society, because if they believe the wrong thing, then we all gonna die. And so it all goes back to this idea that, yeah, as you said, we're a team. We work together, and we need to be critical of the Pentagon, because if they spend too much money on one weapon and not the other, and if there's corruption, then the media is here and we will look at it. Although probably they don't, because the Pentagon has never passed an audit. The media doesn't really make a big fuss about it. It's fascinating that this works, as a way to understand your place in the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be a bit more nuanced about it, you could say that that kind of more, well, that very sort of, I think, explicit sense of being on the same team is evident in Afghanistan in 2001, at least to begin with. Before and after that, maybe less so. So in the 90s, I would argue that, yes, essentially journalists and Western politicians and Western militaries do basically see themselves as on the same side, but with the proviso that journalists understand themselves also as critics of Western policy. And in a certain sense, they are. They're often in that era, in the 90s, they're often very critical of particular policy choices, and they're mostly critical of the kind of hesitancy of Western policy. So it's a criticism, yes, it is a criticism, but it's a kind of criticism that, for the most part, Western politicians are not too troubled by, because underlying it is a kind of basic agreement. It's saying, you're not doing enough.
Yep.
Why aren't you doing more? Why don't you go in harder? Why don't you stay longer? Why don't you hit them with more weaponry? It's that kind of criticism, rather than a more fundamental critique of Western military intervention. So you see that time and again in the 90s. That criticism from the media is essentially urging the West to do more.
It's a criticism of the guy sitting on the horse, hitting the horse, saying like, why are you not going faster? It's not the criticism of the one saying like, please, cavalry, stop. This is wrong. And we see that at the moment also on social media, by the way. There's a lot of criticism on like the US and German and European governments saying like, you're not bombing Hamas enough. You're not giving enough weapons. Ukraine, of course, not enough is going. Those are the media critics, and those are the media critics that actually are being also like handed around in TV shows and so on. Not the ones that say the cavalry needs to stop.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that there's also perhaps a more nuanced thing to say about what happens in the Iraq War in 2003. I think that, again, there is a kind of, as one would expect, there is a kind of, insofar as there's criticism, it's limited. But what there is instead is a kind of, in that war, is a kind of very odd self-consciousness on the part of the media. Almost a kind of ironic distance from events. So journalists tend to report in 2003 Iraq War, they tended to report almost with a kind of self-conscious awareness that they are being used to present an image, right? So take an example, probably the most striking example is when President Bush, the younger now President Bush, got up on an aircraft carrier and made his mission accomplished speech. We've done it. We've mission accomplished. Well, the bit when the BBC came to report that, they couldn't help but talk about how the whole thing was stage managed, how it had been arranged for the cameras, how, this was a media event. So they didn't simply report it straightforwardly. Look, the president made this speech. They were, they felt slightly
aware.
Yes, exactly, self-aware. So there's that kind of slightly, again, it doesn't amount to criticism, certainly not of any fundamental nature, but there is that kind of self-ironical distancing that you start to see in the media then.
It's kind of fascinating. I mean, there we would need to go into also like psychological traits and so on, how these people then still make sense out of it. But maybe we can go the other way, because I really, at this time, I wonder, if we look at how world politics moves, and not just the West, but if we take the West as one of the players, right, then my big question at the moment is realism, the school of IR realism, right when it says that, look, at the end of the day, it's all about power, and every human is, humans in general are trying to maximize power, and systems try to maximize the power. So at the end of the day, what we will have is a contest of powers, and an inevitable contest of powers, especially what John Mearsheimer says, and why it's a tragedy of great power politics. But the criticism on this interpretation is that, well, this is very self-serving. This is how the West does things. This is how the Europeans and Americans and are emigrated Europeans. This is how the West does things. If we take an approach and say, like, no, we have a contest of civilizations, we might have in Russia and China and Iran different civilizations that actually go about stuff differently. And one of the ways to look at that might be through the ways that stories are told. Again, like what I asked before, like, do you think that the Western tradition of understanding things in a Manichaean way, good and bad, God versus devil, and so on, that this thousands of year old tradition weighs upon the way that we also today then create as the West, as a civilizational group, how we create meaning in current affairs? It's maybe a very big question, but what is your hunch?
Yeah, to be honest, I would hesitate to kind of pronounce on that, on that, as you say, big question, whether there is a kind of some deep cultural pattern in the West that means that this is how Westerners tend to look at the world in terms of good and evil, and whether there are other civilizations. I assume you're thinking mainly of China,
Yeah,
that are outside that. Who knows? Maybe you're right. I think I would. The problem with approaching it in that way is that it starts to take your account and your explanation starts to take on a kind of ahistoric quality. It seems like, nothing ever changes. It's all just the same as it has ever been. And personally, I'm a bit more interested in, like, so, what are the historically specific characteristics of any particular moment that lead to either political confrontation or outright war and conflict in some specific context. And I think it, who knows, maybe you're absolutely right to say, well, ultimately it's been down to some kind of,
it is. It's just
sorry, playing tennis. I don't know, but I'm in a way, I think that's to me, that feels more like a kind of evasion of an explanation rather than something that tells me what's going on in the world. I'm much more interested in what are the specifics.
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, if we want to understand what's going on in the world currently, we of course need to read the currently underlying mechanisms correctly. My question was more about whether there's a grander explanation for the mechanisms and what stays the same over time. But then, yeah, it gets historical, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's maybe one way to tackle that topic is I mean, you mentioned it as a kind of civilizational conflict, and the thing that immediately springs to my mind when you say that is Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. And that went, so that kind of perspective, which comes along at the beginning of this post-Cold War era in the 90s, I think is quite transparently a way to try and find some new explanatory framework, some new intellectual framework for understanding. Okay, so it's not left and right anymore. It's not the West and the East. What is it? And he, says, okay, it's this clash of civilizations. I think it's quite transparently being instrumentalized almost immediately for Western policy needs. So, just by wild coincidence, it turns out that the main civilizational fault line runs right through Yugoslavia, and it puts Croatia and Slovenia on one side, according to Samuel Huntington, and Serbia and Bosnia on the other. And that works for a few months, and then it turns out, oh, actually, no, Bosnia's on the same. I mean, it's obvious, it's kind of very obviously contrived to make sense of something that we need explaining right now in a way that then facilitates Western policy. And I think that, that basically what that idea boils down to is how do we intellectually frame the world in a way that will facilitate the projection of Western, primarily American power?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of burning question at the beginning of the 90s. We've lost that old frame. What's the new one? What's the answer? And one of the first answers is, civilizational conflict. It's a clash of civilizations, which is certainly in Samuel Huntington's articulation of it, I think not entirely coherent, but there we are. The other one that comes along very soon after that is the idea of civilizational collapse, that you have civilization represented by the West. Robert Kaplan, I think, is the author who comes up with this. The coming anarchy, he says. And there are certain parts of the world where civilization is just ceasing to exist. It's reverting to a kind of pre-modern state. And he's thinking of states like Somalia, which he says has essentially lost its statehood. It's reverted to a pre-modern condition. And he thinks the Balkans, that's another one where this is, there's going to be anarchy. There's going to be a kind of anarchic, pre-modern world of savagery, and we've got to intervene. But again, the point of the so-called explanation is really just a way. It's a kind of ideological form of this felt need to find a new meaningful framework for the projection of Western power.
Yeah, it's very hard pressed to think of any very popular IR theory or framework that does not paint interventionism as something either natural or even desirable. And even if we go further back, right, with these great ideas of white man's burden and mission civilisatrice, even inside the United States, manifest destiny, that are all explanatory framework that lend themselves to violent expansionism of the dominant group.
Well, with the benefit of sort of now quite a bit of hindsight, you could say that that Cold War era was, a kind of, an exception, in the sense that under the UN system that's established after World War II, you have the kind of the mainstreaming and the at least formal respect, kind of pretty much universally accepted respect for ideas of non-interference in another state's internal affairs and of sovereign equality between states. Obviously, there are a million ways in which those principles were violated throughout the Cold War, but nevertheless,
the principles were set up.
Principles were set up and they were intellectually maintained, so that when you if a political actor violated those, it was understood as a bad thing. This was not the right way to proceed. And immediately after the end of the Cold War, you start to get an explicit questioning of those principles. Ooh, sovereign equality, really? Is that really something? Is sovereignty really all that important? People start to take issue intellectually.
Maybe we need a responsibility to protect in cases where humanitarianism is very much needed by the barrel of a gun. Yeah.
Yeah. So we go very, very quickly from respect for sovereign equality and the principle of non-interference to saying, of course, we've got to intervene. It's imperative. It's a moral imperative that we must intervene.
So that would, to me, indicate that what the Cold War was kind of a prolonged break on traditional colonial conceptions of power projection and expansion of power. And if you think about it, like the Soviets actually explicitly tried to brand themselves as anti-colonial and help that. And the anti-colonial discourse was, of course, branded as communist propaganda that needs to be countered, especially in Africa and Asia.
Yes, and that's another thing. As I was saying, I've gave it as a shorthand end of left and right, which sounds kind of banal and obvious. But that's another dimension of it, is that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the obviously I'm not defending the Soviet Union as some kind of perfect thing, but far from it. But what's collapsed is the idea that there could be an alternative, right? That we could change the system, and part and parcel of that was indeed this idea of anti-imperialism, that the what I think now we say the global south, what we used to call the third world, was deserved the same respect, the same rights, the same status as any other state or any other nation. And the Soviet Union, obviously, in a kind of self-serving and inconsistent way, did, rhetorically at least, support that. And then almost immediately, as I say, after the end of the Cold War, you start to get a very explicit questioning of that. So Somalia, the example I've mentioned a number of times, people said in that case, oh, maybe we should make Somalia a UN protectorate. I mean, that was unthinkable even just a couple of years previously, that someone would argue for that. Well, it didn't happen in Somalia, but pretty soon it did happen in Bosnia.
It was about to say that Bosnia is,
and then it happened again in Kosovo. So you had this big state in the heart of Europe, Yugoslavia, which is torn apart. Bits of it are taken under international protectorate control. There's a kind of the re-emergence of that kind of, that sort of, as you say, like a kind of throwback to 19th century imperialism. Boom, there it is, right in the center of Europe in the 90s. And people carried on as if that's nothing, as if that's some totally normal thing that we have to just expect and live with nowadays.
Yeah, because you don't frame it as such, right? You frame it as something new, as the United Nations taking up its responsibility, right? The mantle of responsibility is like the mantle of responsibility to protect. It's just it's so interesting that right now we live in a moment when all of this kind of comes down, the facade comes down, because the idea of this Riviera in Gaza, right, and then the protectorate governed by, as the proposal was, Tony Blair. It's just you cannot get more 19th century imperialist than proposing that Blair now presides over what's left of from a genocide, and it's just mind-boggling. So in a sense, we're running towards a culmination where all of this becomes so blatant that you don't even try to hide it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, obviously I've been talking mainly about the 90s, but you could I mean, maybe it's important to also talk about what's different and what's starting to change now. And you could say in the same way that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a kind of rhetorical supporter, at least, of anti-colonial movements, and sometimes also a logistical and military supporter of them. So too now maybe you can see Russia and China started to think about playing that same role, and it's very striking to me that how Russia has emerged explicitly and also implicitly China they both essentially emerged as upholders of multipolarity. But what that essentially means in practical terms is also that what they're saying is weaker states don't have to follow the dictates of the West necessarily. And to my mind, I may be obviously naive about it, but to my mind, that's actually a pretty positive development. I think
Mine too.
I think that's one of the that emergence of multipolarity is one of the most positive developments I've seen in in living memory, as it were, because precisely because it does, and no doubt there'll be a certain kind of letdown in the practice, but nevertheless it resurrects that idea, or starts to, of sovereign equality and kind of sovereign independence that we had kind of lost in that post-Cold War era. And the fact that it's making a comeback, albeit in no doubt imperfect ways, I think is a reason for optimism today.
I very much agree with you, and that I think this is a beautiful note to also end the discussion, one that has a hopeful outlook. Phil, like people who want to read more from you, is there a place where you publish things regularly, or is there a place to go to find your books?
There is. I'll send you a link, and you could maybe pop it in the description. I wouldn't say regularly, more like sporadically nowadays. I publish things, but yeah, I've a lot of the stuff I've written is available online. Yes.
Okay, please send me the link. I'll put it into the description of this video below. Everybody, if you want to read more, please follow that link. Phil Hammond, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks.